Coming up in this demo, I take a look at network attached storage and more specifically the UGREEN NAS DXP4800 Plus, which is a simple to use 4-bay NAS device aimed at home users and small business. This NAS comes with a 12th gen Intel 5-core processor, 8GB of DDR5 RAM, 2.5 and 10GB network ports, and it comes with 4 3.5-inch disk bays and 2 internal M.2 slots. As well as providing storage, this NAS also has an app center with a growing list of apps available to install, including support for Docker containers and virtual machines. If you're interested in taking a look at a NAS from UGREEN, they're available from Amazon and also directly from the UGREEN website, and I'll leave links in the video description below. Full disclaimer, UGREEN did send me this NAS device to take a look at, but this isn't a sponsored video. I'll show you how to get up and running with this NAS, from configuring your hard disk to accessing your file shares, and extending the functionality by installing some of the apps from the UGREEN App Center. But first of all, for anyone that isn't familiar with what a NAS is, NAS stands for Network Attached Storage, and in simple terms, it's a box that contains one or more hard drives that can connect to your switch or router to make that storage available to all users and devices on your network. Additionally, NAS devices support industry standard RAID configurations, which basically means you can group multiple hard disks together to appear as a single volume, and this group of disks can survive one or more disk failures, depending on the configuration you choose, but more on that in a second. First, let's get some acronyms out of the way, which will make the rest of this video make a bit more sense. We already know that NAS stands for Network Attached Storage. Next up is RAID, which stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. RAID is a well-established technology for grouping multiple disks together to achieve fault tolerance and also improve disk performance. RAID offers redundancy, where if a disk fails, your data is still accessible on the remaining disks. Next up is JBOD, which means just a bunch of disks. This is the most basic level of RAID and technically isn't actually RAID, as it doesn't offer any redundancy. It just allows you to group multiple disks together so they appear as a single volume. However, if one of the disks fails, you would lose any data that was on that disk. Although, one good thing about JBOD is that you can group together disks of different sizes, whereas with most other RAID configurations, the disks need to be the same size. We'll look at the other RAID configurations that this NAS supports in a second, but first off, let's take a look at the device itself. It comes in a nicely packaged box and looks and feels like a premium device. In the box is the 4-bay NAS device itself, which comes with an external power adapter. You also get 2 high-quality Category 7 Ethernet cables, and there's 2 thermal pads that can be applied to NVMe drives for heat dissipation. Also included are 2 keys which you can use to lock the drive bays in place to avoid accidentally ejecting the disks by mistake. There's tons of connectivity on this device. On the front there's a Type A USB 3.2 port, a USB-C port, and an SD card reader, which is ideal for transferring photos from a digital camera's memory card directly onto the NAS. On the rear there's 2.5 and 10GB Ethernet ports, 2 USB 2 ports and an additional USB 3.2 port, plus a HDMI connection. Connecting a keyboard and mouse to the USB 2 ports and a monitor to the HDMI port allows you to access the NAS directly, for example if you wanted to access the BIOS or reinstall the operating system. You can also cast media to a monitor or TV that's connected to the HDMI port using the UGREEN phone app. If we take a look at the underneath of the NAS, there's a removable cover which allows you to access the internal M.2 and RAM slots. The DXP4800 Plus comes with 8GB of DDR5 memory, and each slot is upgradable to 32GB to allow for a total of 64GB of RAM, which will definitely come in useful if you decide to run any virtual machines on this NAS. The M.2 slots support installing NVMe drives of up to 8TB per slot. These drives can be configured as JBOD or RAID for additional storage, or they can be configured as a disk cache to the main 4-bay disks. With each drive bay allowing you to install up to a 30TB disk, and with up to 16TB of NVMe storage, this NAS can potentially support 136TB of storage. That's the equivalent of 47 million pictures, 142 million files, or 92,000 movies. Okay, let's install some drives into this NAS and get set up. One great thing about UGREEN NAS devices is that they don't lock you into using a specific brand of hard drive. Although they do have a compatibility list, you're free to use whatever drives you want. To install a drive, press at the bottom of the drive bay and the tray handle pops out. Gently pull on the handle to pull out the drive tray, and on the underside of the tray, press on the small tab on the right hand side and extend the side outwards. You can then slot in the hard drive, lining up the notches on the tray with the screw holes on the disc, then push the side of the tray back in. Slide the disk tray back into the NAS and push at the bottom of the tray until it clicks back into place. Once you've got your drives installed, connect an Ethernet cable to one of the network ports on the back of the NAS and then you can power it on using the button on the front. Give it a couple of minutes to boot into the operating system, then we should be ready to go through the setup process. There's a few different methods for connecting to your UGREEN NAS. You can download and run the Windows desktop app, install the UGREEN mobile app, or use a web browser. I've already downloaded and installed the app from the UGREEN website, so I'll go ahead and run that, but if you're on an Apple, Mac or a Linux machine, you can use a web browser to set up the NAS by browsing to find.ugnas.com. As it's a new device, we need to click on New Device Registration. The app will then scan your network and should detect your new device, and it will show the model, serial number, MAC address and the IP address of the device that it's detected. Go ahead and click on Register. You can then assign the new device a name. You can accept the default name or you can change it to something else. I'm going to leave it on the default because this NAS has a cool feature where you can add an additional custom name and use that when accessing the NAS, and I'll show you that later in the video. We then need to tick the box to accept the user agreement and then click Next. Now we need to set an administrator account for the NAS. This is the main admin account that you'll use to configure the various options and install apps. We can create additional user accounts later once the NAS is fully configured. I'll call my admin account NAS admin and enter a password and then click Next. Note that the username and password is case sensitive. Next, you'll get the option of enabling remote access to your NAS. This allows you to access the files on your NAS when you're away from home. I'll skip this for now, but you can come back and enable this later if you do need remote access. Next, we need to choose an update method. I'll go ahead and select the recommended option and click Initialize. The NAS will then check for any available updates and finish the setup. We then get a user guide that you can click through to show you parts of the operating system, but I'll skip through that as I'll be showing you that next. Initially, the storage setup wizard will start. I'll come back to this in a second as we'll take a look around the operating system first. You'll see a list of tasks to do to get started with your NAS, but I'll hide that for a second so I can show you around. Let's maximize the window to get a better view. So this is UGOS, the UGREEN operating system. This is where you configure how you want the NAS to work, but you can also interact with the apps that you can install later. In the top left, there's a monitor icon that you can use to get back to the desktop at any time. So if you have any apps open, you can quickly return to the desktop by clicking on this icon. The square icon with dots is the My Apps window. Clicking here will show all the apps that you currently have installed. In the top right corner, there's a CPU and RAM widget. You can quickly check the current CPU and RAM usage by hovering over this widget, or you can double click on the widget and it will open up the task manager, where you can see a lot more info about your NAS, including CPU temperature, network speeds and hard disk info. The next icon along is another widget that if you single click, it gives you quick access to some more information about your NAS. You can see how long the NAS has been online for and the IP address that's been assigned to it. And you can use a web browser to browse this IP address and access the UGOS from any device. You don't always need to use the desktop app. Hovering over the next icon tells you the connection type you're currently using to connect to the NAS. The next icon that looks like a hamburger is the task center. Certain tasks like uploading or downloading files will appear in the task center so you can monitor the status of the task. The bell icon is the notification center. Various notifications will appear in here, for example, creating or removing storage or connecting an external device. Then we have a search icon which allows you to search your NAS for files and folders. Next, we've got a profile icon. In here we can increase or decrease the zoom size of the desktop, change some personal settings like desktop wallpaper, and choose what menu bar options to have enabled. You can also reboot or shut down the NAS from here, switch the user account or just log out. And finally, you have the typical minimize, maximize and close buttons. The first thing we need to do is set up some storage, so go ahead and click on the storage icon. You'll get a welcome message with some information about storage. Click on Next to continue and it tells us the steps we need to complete to configure some storage. First, we need to create a storage pool. A storage pool is basically a group of disks you want to pool together to create some storage. This is where you tell the system what type of RAID configuration you want to use. Then we create a volume that sits inside that storage pool. Think of a volume like you would a partition on a hard disk. You can create one or more volumes within a storage pool and format those volumes with a file system. So let's click on Create. We then get a list of hard drives and any NVMe storage that's currently installed and available for selection. In this NAS, I've got 4 4TB hard disks and 2 238GB NVMe drives. Be aware that you can't mix HDD and SSD drives in the same storage pool. Depending on how many disks you select, that will determine what RAID configurations are available. Each RAID type shows a brief explanation of what that RAID level does, how many disks are required to create that storage pool, as well as how many disk failures that it can tolerate before there will be any data loss. Let's take a quick look at the different RAID levels available on the DXP4800 Plus. A basic RAID type is just a single disk on its own, similar to a disk in a PC or a laptop. You can't add any additional disk to a basic disk later, and if the disk fails, you lose the data that was stored on that disk. JBOD is just a bunch of disks. You can group 1 to 4 disks of equal or different sizes together in a JBOD configuration. All the selected disks will be added together in a single pool. You get access to all of the storage. For example, if you include a 1TB, a 2TB and a 4TB disk in a JBOD configuration, the total storage for that pool would be 7TB. JBOD is not fault tolerant, however, so if one of those disks fails, you would lose any data that was on that particular disk. RAID 0 needs a minimum of 2 disks to be selected, but can support up to 4 disks to be grouped together. Data is striped across all the disks to improve disk performance, however there is no fault tolerance at all. If one of the disks fails, you lose the entire storage pool, meaning you will lose all data. And the more disks you include in RAID 0, the higher the risk of data loss there is, because there are more disks that can potentially fail. That's why RAID 0 is affectionately known as Scary RAID. RAID 1 is known as mirroring and is the first type of RAID that includes fault tolerance and is commonly used with 2 disks. Data that's written to the first disk is also written or mirrored to the second disk. If one of the disks fails, 100% of the data is available on the remaining disk. The downside of using RAID 1 is that you only get to use the capacity of one disk, as the other disk or disks are used for fault tolerance. For example, if you configure 2 4TB disks in a RAID 1 mirror, the total available storage would be 4TB and not 8TB. Next, we have RAID 5, which needs to have a minimum of 3 disks, but can support more. Data is striped across all disks, but unlike RAID 0, RAID 5 also includes some parity information. This means that if one of the disks fails, the data can be rebuilt on the remaining drives, so there is no data loss. You do lose some of the capacity of all the disks, but RAID 5 is a good balance between performance, redundancy, and storage efficiency. RAID 6 is similar to RAID 5, but uses double parity information, so you can survive up to 2 disk failures and no data will be lost. However, the write speed is slower than RAID 5 due to calculating the extra parity, and the available storage is also less than RAID 5. And finally, RAID 10 is a combination of RAID 1 and RAID 0 and needs a minimum of 4 disks. Data in the first pair of disks is mirrored, and then the mirror is striped to the second pair of disks. RAID 10 offers a higher disk performance and high redundancy. You can lose at least 1 drive, but potentially up to 2 drives, as long as the 2 drives that fail are in different pairs. The important thing in any RAID configuration is that if a disk fails, you should replace that disk as soon as possible to re-establish the redundancy. Otherwise, if another disk fails, then you could lose data. I've got 4 4TB disks installed in this NAS, and I'll create a RAID 5 volume using all 4 disks, which will give me a usable capacity of 10.8TB and will be able to survive 1 disk failure without losing data. So I'll select all 4 disks and click on RAID 5. Then click Next. We then need to create a volume that sits inside that storage pool. You can create 1 or more separate volumes, but I'll just use the entire capacity on a single volume. Then we need to choose the file system that the volume will be formatted with, and you can choose between ext4 and BTRFS. ext4 has better performance, whereas BTRFS supports snapshots and disk quotas. I like the idea of being able to recover from previous versions of files from snapshots, so I'll choose BTRFS and click Next. I'll click Create, then Format. We get prompted to enter the administrator password, as the next steps will wipe any existing data on the drives and create the new volume. You can start using your storage straight away, although it will take several hours for the storage pool to fully sync across all disks. Until it fully syncs, the volume is not fault tolerant and the disk performance won't be optimal, but you can start saving files and installing apps straight away. So let's go ahead and create our first shared folder. We can use the Files app to create and manage our shared folders. Click on Shared Folder on the left hand side, then click on New Shared Folder. I'll name this shared folder Media, as this folder will be for storing movies, TV shows, photos and music that I've digitized from my DVDs and box sets. We then need to choose a storage location by clicking on the storage drop down, but as I've only created one volume so far, that's the only option I can select. I'm going to ignore the usage limit as I don't want this folder to be limited, but if you wanted to stop the folder from growing beyond a certain disk size, you could enter a usage limit here. And you can enable or disable a recycle bin for this share. I'll click on create, then we can specify who has access to this shared folder. I only have one admin user so far, but any additional users I create will show up here, and you can specify whether those users have read and write permission, just read only, or if you don't want a particular user to be able to access the data at all, you can select access denied. Once you've set your permissions, click on OK and the shared folder will be created. We can then go inside that folder and create additional subfolders. I'll click on the add icon and choose create a new folder. I'll call this one movies and I'll repeat that process to create a TV shows, photos and music folder. So I'm now ready to copy some files into this shared folder, and there's a couple of different ways to do this. The first way is to simply drag and drop files from your desktop into the folders on the NAS via the app or web browser. So if I go back to my Windows desktop, I can just drag and drop a file into the shared folder. We'll get prompted to say what should happen if you copy any files with duplicate names of files that may already exist on the NAS. I know this file doesn't exist, so I'll leave it on skip and press OK. That file or folder will then start copying to the shared folder. You won't see a progress bar like you would in Windows, but you can monitor the progress of the file copy by clicking into the task manager. Another method for copying data to the NAS is to connect a USB disk to one of the USB ports on the NAS. You'll see a notification pop up telling you a storage device has been inserted, and you'll notice that you'll get an extra option in the Files app called Peripheral. Peripheral is whatever USB disk you inserted, so you can click on that and browse the contents of the USB disk. To copy some files from the USB, simply navigate to the file or folder and right-click and then choose Copy To. You can then browse to a destination folder on your NAS and click Confirm to start copying the file. Again, you can check the status of the file copy by going into the Task Center. Another way to access data on your NAS is to connect over the network using a Samba share, or SMB share for short. SMB shares are generally how Windows connects to a shared folder over a network, but SMB also works on macOS and Linux. First, we need to enable SMB, so let's go into the control panel, which you can get to by clicking on the desktop icon. The control panel has lots of options that you can use to modify the functionality of your NAS. We'll come back to this later, but for now, let's go into the file service option, and the first tab is SMB. Go ahead and enable the SMB service. Then click Apply. If I go back to my Windows machine, I can browse to the NAS by entering / and the IP address of the NAS. It will then prompt for a username and password of a user who has access to this NAS. I only have my admin user created so far, so I'll enter the admin username and password, and I'll tick to remember the password so it doesn't prompt me for the password next time, and I'll click OK. We can then see any shares that have been set up on the NAS that user has permission to see. You'll also be able to see the contents of any USB disks that are plugged into the NAS. But entering an IP address every time we want to access files on the NAS is a bit tedious. We can make this a bit easier by browsing to the name of the NAS instead of the IP address. If you remember back when we were first setting up the NAS, we had the option to change the name. You can browse to the name of the NAS, which is generally easier to remember than the IP address. However, you may remember that I left the name as the default name, which isn't that much easier to type in. That's where the custom device name comes in. If we go back into the control panel and click on device connection, we can enter a new custom name. I'll change the custom name to NAS, which is nice and easy to type when browsing from File Explorer or a web browser. So now I can just type / NAS and press enter, and I can get into my shared folders. If you wanted to make it even easier than that, you can map a network drive by right-clicking on the shared folder and selecting Map Network Drive. Choose any available drive letter, then click on Finish. I'll choose M for Media, but you can choose any letter that's available. So now, anytime I go into File Explorer, I can just click on the M drive to go straight to my Media folder. Okay, let's take another quick look at the control panel. There's so many apps and features available on this UGREEN NAS that I can't cover them all in one video, but I do want to highlight a couple of things in the control panel. The first one is User Management. This is where you can add or remove users on your NAS. User accounts are needed to allow you to set up permissions so you can specify who can or can't access certain files or folders. I'll go ahead and create a new user by clicking on Add and Create. Enter a name and password, then specify whether the new user is a common user or an administrator. I've already configured my admin user account, which is the one I'm using now, so any additional users I create, I'll make them a common user. The email address and description fields are optional, so I'll leave them blank and click Next. We then get a list of shared folders so we can choose which folders to let the new user access. I've only got one shared folder so far, so I'll give the new user read and write access and click on Done. The next control panel item I want to show you is Hardware and Power. In here you can change the power management of the NAS and you have the options of High Performance, Balanced or Energy Saver. We can also create a startup and shutdown schedule so that you can set the NAS to automatically power down at the end of the day and start back up the next morning. This can save on power when you're not using the NAS, for example when you're asleep at night. And last but not least, I want to show you the network section. You can configure the two network connections in here. For example, you could manually set the IP address details if you didn't want to use DHCP, or you could specify different DNS settings. You can also configure things like link aggregation and network bridging. Okay, let's move on to the final part of this video and take a look at the App Center. Modern NAS devices go far beyond simple storage. This NAS has access to a built-in App Center which you can use to extend the functionality of the NAS by installing apps or Docker containers, and the possibilities are almost endless. You can even install full virtual machines. There's too many apps to mention, but I want to pick out a few key apps that I think will help you get the best from this NAS. And it's a bit like any app store where you get a list of apps to install and there's also a search function. UGREEN have conveniently grouped together 5 apps that they think most people will want to use, and 3 of these are apps that I want to mention here. So I'll go ahead and click on Install on the NAS Common Software option, and a few minutes later the apps will be installed and available to use. First up is Sync and Backup. This app has a lot of different options for syncing and backing up data to and from your NAS. You can create sync tasks to synchronize data between a PC or laptop and the UGREEN NAS, as well as synchronizing data from one UGREEN NAS to another. You can also create backups where you back up selected folders to your NAS, or you can back up your NAS to another UGREEN NAS or another rsync location. You can also back up data between different storage pools on the same NAS. So there's lots of different ways to create backups for your data. Just be aware that to back up a computer to the NAS, you need to ensure that you're using the app via the UGOS desktop app rather than the web browser. But all the other backup and sync options are available via the web interface as well. Next up is the Photos app. This app lets you create personal photo libraries for each user of the NAS, as well as shared libraries that can be made available to multiple users. The admin user can specify who can access a shared library. One cool feature of this app is that you can add AI training models so that you can train the app to recognize people, pets, objects and more. You can access your photo libraries from any device, including your cell phone, using the mobile app. This is a great alternative to storing photos in a public cloud like Google Photos, which can be expensive once you get beyond a certain storage limit. The next app I want to mention is Cloud Drives, which lets you set up a connection between your NAS and cloud storage. Once you've set up a connection to some cloud storage, you can upload files from your NAS to the cloud or download files from the cloud to your NAS. You can also set up one-way or two-way synchronization between your NAS and your cloud storage, which is ideal for getting extra backups of your critical data. Another great app you can use on your NAS is Jellyfin. Jellyfin is a well-known media server that allows you to stream movies, TV shows, music and photos from your NAS to your devices, so you don't need to rely on the cloud. You install the Jellyfin app from the UGREEN App Center, and there's client apps available for iOS, Android, Amazon Fire Sticks and many other TVs and devices, as well as any web browser. Once you have the app installed and configured, it points to a media location on your NAS and presents all your movies and TV shows in a nice home screen. You can then stream that media to any device. And lastly, just to finish up this video, I wanted to mention that you can get even more functionality from this NAS by installing virtual machines and Docker. Virtual machines are where you can install a complete operating system like Windows 11 or Linux to a virtual PC hosted on your NAS. You can then access that virtual PC from any device on your network. And Docker is a platform where you can get access to thousands of Docker containers which you can then host on your NAS. A Docker container is similar to installing an app from the UGREEN App Center, except you acquire the app from the Docker platform. You can search the Docker Hub to see the many different Docker containers available. And that just about wraps up this video about getting started with the UGREEN NAS DXP4800 Plus. Check out the description below for links to Amazon and UGREEN where you can pick up this device, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions or thoughts about this NAS. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.